Hello and welcome to this podcast from the Irish Linen Centre and Lisburn Museum. My name's James, I'm the research officer at the museum, and I'm delighted to be joined by Scott Edgar of Wartime NI. Today we'll be speaking about Lisburn and the Second World War. Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me. It's good to be on this side of a podcast desk for a change and not have to worry about pressing all the right buttons and doing all the technical stuff. So I'm pretty relaxed here.
Great. So, Scott, tell us about yourself. How did you get interested in the Second World War?
Well, I have been running Wartime NI for just over 10 years now. I was a website developer, so actually setting up the website and everything in the kind of technical side of things was fairly easy to me. I didn't quite anticipate exactly how much research there was going to be and how much work there was going to be. And, I always recount this little kind of family anecdote where, like, every time I go home, my mum will say, "You must be nearly done by now." You would think that. You would think at a finite 6-year window of time in a place as small as Northern Ireland, you could wrap it up in 10 years, but no, there's just more and more stories every time. But it all started for me with a conversation in the pub, which is where I like to have lots of my conversations. And somebody had said, I just moved to East Belfast, and somebody said, "Oh, have you been up to the American Cemetery in Lisburn?" And I'd never heard of the American Cemetery in Lisburn. They were like, "It's Second World War." So I thought, why is there a Second World War cemetery? Why is it an American cemetery? What's it doing in the Castlereagh Hills? Put my hiking boots on, went up. This was 2013. So it was just before it all got revamped and kind of done up by the council. So there was no big memorial there. It was just a little bench with a field overlooking Belfast and a little tiny plaque just telling you a little bit about the history. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. There were 148 American service personnel buried up there in that plot in the Castlereagh Hills. And to go back to, are you nearly done yet? You start to realize that each of those 148 people had their own story. Why was that person in Northern Ireland? Where did they come from? What were they doing here? Why were the Americans here at all? And the research just spiraled from that. But way before that, when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I used to sit with my granny watching black and white films on a Saturday afternoon. So you'd be watching, Battle of Britain or A Bridge Too Far or something like that. And she'd sit there and have a draw of her cigarette and tell me, "Oh, your granda used to drive tanks past the pyramids in Egypt, and your granda escaped from 2 prisoner of war camps, and your granda did this, and your granda did that." This man sounded like an absolute superhero. He passed away when I was 5, so I never had the chance to talk to him about all of these things. But in adult life, I've gone away and researched his kind of military career, his service, and found out that contrary to just my granny telling tall tales, every single word of it is true. So escaped 2 prisoner of war camps, fought in Egypt and Libya, drove a tank through the desert. All 100% true. And just having those local connections and family connections and everything just keeps it really kind of fresh and interesting for me. And there's always something else to follow up on and to learn.
Great. So the Second World War begins 1939. The Allies initially, it's the United Kingdom, France, and Poland, and then like a USA and Soviet Union join in later. They're fighting against Germany, Italy, Japan.
Yep.
And the war ends with the defeat of Germany and Japan in 1945. So that's big picture stuff, but let's bring it in local. So how does Northern Ireland fit into the Second World War? What's its contribution to the war effort?
Northern Ireland's contribution to the war effort is fairly significant. I mean, on a kind of top level, you're talking about 50,000 people from Northern Ireland who served during the Second World War. So think talking to other historians, I think it's about 50,000 from the north and 70,000 from the south. And what you have to remember is that all of those people volunteered for various political reasons. There was no conscription in Northern Ireland, so every single person who signed up for Army, Air Force, Navy, or any of the women's services did so of their own volition. But more than that, Northern Ireland contributed in a massive way to the materiel of war. So Harland and Wolff were building and repairing and refitting ships for both the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy. You had the aircraft factory out there, Short and Harland on Queen's Island as well, just across from the shipyard. So they were making planes that became kind of iconic symbols of the Second World War, like the Stirling bomber and the Sunderland flying boat. And just you kind of forget about the massive effort that goes in to something like fitting out an army. Up in Derry, they were making shirts, Irish linen shirts for service personnel, and they were churning out millions of them. And right down, everything came. A lot of things came from Irish linen, which is obviously a great thing to be talking about here. Exactly. In the linen centre. But linen was used to cover the wings of the Hawker Hurricane planes, which fought in the Battle of Britain and beyond that. It's used obviously for uniforms. It was used for parachutes. So just many uses for that. Belfast had the largest rope works I think in the world at that time. So that was obviously to do with being in close proximity to the shipyard as well. But when you think about the Royal Navy going out there and the amount of rope and stuff they need, people needing uniforms, and so much of that stuff was coming from Northern Ireland.
And it's strategically important as well, isn't it?
Strategically very well placed. Last week there was the 79th anniversary of the surrender of the U-boats up in Derry, Londonderry. And that was chosen by, I believe, chosen by Churchill as the site for the U-boat surrender, because the port up there at Lisburn had played such a central role in defeating the U-boats in the Battle of the Atlantic. So right around that coast, you had places like Castle Archdale and Fermanagh. Planes flying in and out of there. Plane flying from Castle Archdale was the first to spot and sort of help bring about the sinking of the Bismarck. And then obviously you're not on the mainland of Britain, so you're that little bit removed. It was kind of seen as a safer part of the UK to be in, and you're on the Atlantic side, so you're the perfect bridging point for Americans coming over the Atlantic, and a nice kind of jumping off point for them then to get into the European theatre of operations.
But there was still a threat, though, that there might be a German invasion of Ireland as sort of like a back door of getting into the UK, wasn't there?
Yeah, certainly in 1940 and then through into maybe 41, that threat was fairly real. Looking back on it now, we have to remember as historians that we've got the benefit of hindsight. People didn't have that in 1940, so this threat that Germany would invade the United Kingdom or come up into Ulster, coming up through Ireland, it was a very real fear that people had. And if people are kind of out and about, there's still remnants of that. There are towns and villages where you can still see pillboxes built. I'm originally from Portadown, and all along the River Bann there, kind of out towards Guildford and on out to Scarva, there's still concrete pillboxes that were kind of put up in 1939, 1940, overlooking rivers, railway lines, places where they thought that Axis forces could be coming up.
Yeah, and you've sort of touched on it there, but what would everyday life have been like in Lisburn, where we are tonight, and I guess throughout the rest of Northern Ireland? How many people have contributed to the war effort, or what was daily life like in a 1940s, early 1940s town?
So officially, Northern Ireland was at war in much the same way as the rest of the United Kingdom was. So right from the start of September 1939, the blackout was enforced. We had rationing of food, of fuel, of all those kinds of things, as well as the rest of the United Kingdom. But from reading people's kind of diaries and memoirs, you get this kind of feeling, certainly through from 1939 to 41, that it was all a bit lax here. Like, people didn't have the same fear. There was a prevailing attitude that we were further away from Germany and further away from mainland Europe, and obviously you England, Scotland, and Wales in the way. There's a little buffer zone, so people find it difficult to sign up to enlist in the civil defense services. They didn't really feel a part of the war, and certainly in 1939 and 1940 that was seen just kind of throughout various parts of Europe as the phony war. So there was almost this stalemate going on of, are we at war, are we not at war? So life kind of went on as normal. Americans and stuff who were traveling around Ireland, both north and south, were just looking around and had this like, is there not a war on? There are people talked about people lazing around on the grounds of City Hall in Belfast and spending hours over their lunch, and it just didn't seem to be the same thrust. But all that obviously changed in 1941 then, when the Luftwaffe attacked Belfast, Newtownards, Bangor, and Derry, Londonderry. Places like Lisburn, and in particular kind of smaller villages and towns around, changed dramatically. In some small villages in 1942, when the American forces arrived, their population went up by 10%. So at their peak, I think there were 130,000 Americans in Northern Ireland. Over the course of 4 years, that was a total of 300,000 Americans. And they brought with them all the things that the cliches that you hear, the nylon stockings, the Hershey chocolate, the good time music, and kind of teaching Irish women how to jitterbug and jive and all those things. So there was a much more kind of worldly input into what was still a very kind of pastoral and rural country. So yeah, things changed in big ways culturally, if not, actually being at war.
And have you got a key fact about Lisburn on the Second World War that our listeners might find interesting? Or it doesn't have to be a weird fact, but yeah, is there anything just if you pick out something?
Well, I have there is a story. Because I obviously I had like all podcasters, I had a little sneaky look at the questions there. So while I've been talking, I've been rattling through some potential Lisburn stories, and this one's not from right in the centre of Lisburn, but it's not too far away. Yeah. So there is a plane or parts of a plane out at the Ulster Aviation Society at the Maze there, which is the former Longkesh airfield. And that plane belonged to a pilot called Peter Locke. And Peter Locke ditched that plane in Portmore Lock, which is just up towards Ballinderry direction, yeah. And he survived the crash. Years and years later, we're talking maybe like 50 years later, the plane was recovered from the lock, and it's all being refurbished. You can now see that in Ulster Aviation Society. But there was all talk, and what was Peter Locke doing? What was the flight about? Why was he flying over the lock? How did he crash? All those kinds of things. So turns out Peter Locke was on his way to Christmas dinner, squadron Christmas dinner, and he'd been out on a flight and gone back, got into his nice uniform, go for going to the Christmas dinner. So it was up in northwest somewhere. I can't remember exactly where he was going, but different airfield up that direction. And he'd pulled on the coveralls and just over the nice thing. Something went wrong with the plane, ditched it in the lock. And what happens when you're in a plane, you've got your what they call Mae West, the life jacket on. they had this little compartment in them which was filled with like a gooey kind of bright yellow, almost like an ink, like paint. And what happened was when you hit water, that opened up and it left a little trail of this yellow stuff on the top of the water. So this enabled anybody else flying over or people in boats who were coming out to rescue you could follow this little yellow line. But that also meant that his good dress uniform got absolutely ruined with yellow dye. So Peter Locke had a lucky escape. Plane was recovered. It's a fantastic bit of thing to look at, and you know you can get the whole story at Ulster Aviation Society. And Peter Locke made his way up to Christmas dinner in an absolutely sodden uniform covered in yellow dye.
That's a remarkable story. Now, we often think about war being associated with men fighting on the front, but women also played a vital role, didn't they? Could you maybe briefly describe some of the ways that they became involved in the war effort?
Yeah, there was big changes for women, not just in Northern Ireland, but across the UK and across Europe. During the Second World War, many traditionally male jobs in factories were vacated by men who'd gone off to fight. As well as that, the level of work had gone up. So you know, places like shipyards were churning out more and more planes or more and more ships. All of that needed more and more material. So you'd places making munitions, making shells, making bullets. Factories that had previously been doing other things, more agricultural kind of tasks. There's places like that they would have been doing like tanning leather. There's a massive workshop there with tools. So tanning leather was kind of put on the back burner, and that all systems go making bullets and shells. And women fitted into those roles and took them on and did extremely well in them. My own grandmother worked out in a factory in Portadown, and it's the same one that I used to watch the black and white movies with. So she used to always say, "I made the bullets, and your granda fired them." Um, and yeah, they took on that role, and of course there were women who served in the forces as well. The ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the Women's Air Force, and the RANS, the Women's Royal Navy. There's so many good kind of archive memoirs and then kind of stories and oral histories from women who served in those forces. Where I find women really come into their own in my research is their documenting of things like the Belfast Blitz. Women were tremendous. I know it sounds like a terrible cliche, but they were much more likely to be keeping diaries and writing letters than men were. So, unlike a lot of other history, it's actually quite easy to find women's voices in Second World War history in Northern Ireland. The diaries, the letters, journals, everything is out there.
So let's talk about wartime NI, Scott. What is it? How did it start? Where can people find more information about it?
I mean, at its most simple, wartime NI is a hobby that has spiraled out of all control. 10 years ago, it started off as a personal blog. Excuse me. It started off as a personal blog. Like I said, I went up to that cemetery in Lisburn and I just wrote a couple of paragraphs about it and put up a couple of photos. And then some of my friends were interested in it, and then they told other people about it, and people were contacting me and going, "Oh, do you know about this thing? And do you know about that thing? And have you been up to the Blitz graves in Belfast?" And all of these stories started coming in. So now, 10 years on, Wartime NI is it's a website, or occasionally I will use the term online portal, which sounds a lot fancier than it is. But there are thousands of articles on there. So there are articles on things like sport, like American sports, the baseball that was played at Windsor Park, American football played at Ravenhill, first ever ice hockey teams we had. You've got diary excerpts from people who survived and wrote about the Blitz. Got many articles on there about American forces, Australian airmen, Polish pilots. Yeah, and there's profiles of people from here who served. Some of them sadly killed during the war. Others survived, come back, told their stories. Accompanying that, I also have my own podcast, 21 episodes of that. It's called A Wee Bit of War. It's available on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. So yeah, it's A Wee Bit of War, and I've been very fortunate to interview some great historians. So I've chatted to people like Jim O'Neill and Michael Fryer from NI War Memorial. Chatted to authors like Mary Pat Kelly, who was an absolute sensation on it. She's written and made documentaries about the American forces who came here. And I also had the absolute privilege to interview Rachel Levy, who's a Holocaust survivor who survived her time in both Auschwitz and Belsen and ended up on a resettlement farm in Mill Isle in County Down.
Excellent. So check out Wartime NI online.
That's it.
Yeah.
Wartime NI on all the socials, and you'll find the website.
And have you any advice for people thinking about blogging on their historical interest, not just Second World War, but anything at all?
My advice is just do it. If you are interested in it, someone else will be interested in it. No matter how niche you think that your field of interest is, if you're into it, someone else out there in the world will be into it, and it's easier now than ever before to reach people in. I get emails from America, Canada, Australia, all across Europe. Got one the other day from South Africa, so you can be talking about your very nerdy hobby or whatever it is you have, whatever your little niche bit of interest is, and someone out there in the world will find it. Don't need to be great at making websites. You don't need to be a professional podcaster. Just start reading, start writing content, and get it out there.
Well, it's been great to chat, Scott, and I'm really looking forward to your talk on Lisburn and the Second World War, which is part of our D-Day 80 Talks program. So thanks for coming in to chat.
Thanks for having me. It's been great. Thank you.